All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Going back to our tafsir, inshallah. And certainly, yesterday, we actually looked at a number of different things. We looked at a PowerPoint. I don't know if you remember, but we did this PowerPoint right there. And we went in details with this PowerPoint. And we also did, let's look into what we did. Let's see. So we talked about the signs in Surah Al'an'am and what it was talking about. And we also went in certain details in regards to certain ayat. And we took pretty much, each and every single verse and what it contains and the purpose within that verse. And then we jumped into talking about the relationship with the verses with the previous ayat. And then we talked about the practical lessons to learn from these ayat in making them something that we would sense and we would have a relationship with. So I'm not going to go over that, but just go over the video and what we talked about yesterday in order to get into at least those key points. We also went in Tafseer al-Qurtubi and we talked about some words in Tafseer al-Qurtubi. We talked about the different qira'at in regards to فالق الحب والنوى, or is it فلق الحب والحب, فرق الحب والنوى, sorry, because that would make it a maf'ul bihi right there. Okay, or and again qira'at جعل الليل سكنا or جاعل الليل سكنة. And we talked about والقمر حسبانا. We talked about, of course, فالق الإصباح, or is it فلق الإصباح or الأصباح with a different قراءة. And we talked about what those variants would actually mean, okay, and the implication it has basically in having that tafsir. So we went in some details with that, but now we're going to get back to basically the ayat right there and talk about وَهُوَ الَّذِي. Oh no, did I lose it? Hold on, where is it? Put a line on it. I think this is it. Okay, this is bad. Okay. Then we also talked about وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنشَأَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدٍ. And he had created you from one nafs. And we talked about that one nafs a little bit. And we said, is this Adam alayhi salam, or is this talking about nafs and wahida, that we pretty much embody the same spirit, the same soul? In other words, we may vary in certain behaviors, we may vary in certain things, but we pretty much are with the same structure. Is that what it means? Most of the scholars actually said min nafsi wahida to mean Adam alayhi salam. And then, of course, certainly embodying that. فَمُسْتَقَرُّ وَمُسْتَوْدَعُ. I think this is where we left off at. So the word فَمُسْتَقَرُّ وَمُسْتَوْدَعُ. Oh, actually, we left off at this one. This is where we left off at. Okay, we're going to go back. Okay. جَاعِلُ اللَّيْلِ سَكَنًا, another qira'ah. Oh, sorry about that. I think I jumped. Okay, so we're still here. Sorry about that. Okay. So let's say الموطأ. What is الموطأ? Let me just give you an idea about الموطأ. الموطأ is actually the book that Imam Malik had compiled of different hadith, different thought. What's the difference between a hadith and an athar? In hadith is basically the quote that goes back to the Prophet ﷺ. Al-athar goes back to the Sahabi. Okay, Imam Malik, who was living in Medina, he basically had a number of different narrations to Al-Muwatta. So what does that mean? You had different scholars basically compile the different narrations that Imam Malik was basically compiling, and based on that, he had different narrations from Muwatta. Muwatta is in about 800 pages. It can be in one volume, it can be sometimes in three, depending on basically the copy. Okay, let's say he said that Yahya ibn Sa'id had narrated that أنه بلغه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يدعو فيقول اللهم فالق الإصباح وجاعل الليل سكنا والشمس والقمر حسبانا اقضي عني الدين وأغنني من الفقر وأمتعني بسمعي وبصري وقوتي في سبيلك. Okay, what was the Prophet ﷺ making the dua to say? Okay, that the Prophet ﷺ used to make the dua and say, "Oh Allah, you are the one that splits the dawn and makes the night as makes the night a place of sakan." What is sakan? Sakan can mean a place of dwelling and could also mean a place of tranquility, a place of calmness. So we're talking about a place, or are we talking about a time? We're talking about time, or are we talking about place? Okay, so it can actually be both. That during the night you dwell at home, and the night hour is basically the time. Okay, so when you look at a second, the inference that we get out of that is that during the nighttime is the time that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically structured and built within you to want to one, find peace, find calmness, find basically that moment that you're not putting in the physical effort, and that's basically the structure of your body and even the society. وَالشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ حُسْبَانًا. When you look at الشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ حُسْبَانًا, the sun and the moon are in husban. We're going to get to the word husban because some scholars actually said husban means in rotation. Some scholars said husban actually means in a certain structure. And other scholars actually said husban means fire. That's kind of odd that husban means fire, and another said husban means light. We're going to get to why would they even say husban means that and not perhaps structure or rotation. Okay, so I want you to learn a couple of things in this dua. I'm going to erase some of these highlights. That way you could actually see it little by little. So when you look at Allahumma faliq al-isbah, oh Allah, the one that splits the dawn, makes the night a place, times for tranquility, and the sun and the moon in orbit or in light or whatever, al-husban would basically mean depending on the scholar. Okay, and then I want you to see that because there's a prelude, there's a premise. So whenever you make a dua, before you get into the point that you would want to make as a request, you first have to think of it as relating yourself with the power of the Lord Almighty. And that's the same thing even when you look at Surah Al-Fatiha. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. What are you relating yourself with? You're relating yourself with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His power, His magnificence, His highness, and then اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. Then you're making your request. Okay, that's the same thing. The Prophet ﷺ basically followed that paradigm and said, and started out with connecting himself, recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being faliq al-isbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making the night basically found tranquility, Shams wal Qamar, those celestial beings that we would say basically in a certain orbit, following the structure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, and then he would make the request. What is iqdi? Iqdi means compensate. Iqdi can mean to pay back. Iqdi can mean to basically make over. Okay, so when you say iqdi anni dayn, in other words, pay and repay. Dayn. What is dayn? Dayn is debt. So he's asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to basically help him pay the debt that he owns. وَأَغْنِنِي مِنَ الْفَقْرِ, and keep poverty away from me. أغنني. What is أغنني? أغنني means, does that mean he's asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be rich? But he never got rich. But no, it's to basically not be in need. Not be in need. وَأَغْنِنِي مِنَ الْفَقْرِ, and give me that self-efficiency away from being in poverty. وَأَمْتِعْنِي بِسَمْعِي وَبَصَرِي وَقُوَّتِي فِي سَبِيلِكَ, and let me engage or enjoy my hearing, my sight, and my body power for your sake. Okay, I want you to look at right there. In Al-Muwatta and Ibn Abd al-Barr, of course, Maliki, and of course, being Maliki Ibn Abd al-Barr is considered, in his book, At-Tamheed. At-Tamheed is almost in 23 volumes. It's a huge book. At-Tamheed is a huge book. And Ibn Abd al-Barr basically wanted to do somewhat of a sharh, somewhat of a detailed explanation for the book Al-Muwatta. And he said, that this hadith يتصل من وجوه, that this hadith can find an authentic chain of narration from different resources. And therefore, in other words, Ibn Abd al-Barr is telling us, well, we do actually have a good resource for that. Okay, so let's see. Is there a difference between debt and loan? Well, yeah, when you are in debt to someone else, you're in debt, someone else needs money from you. When you get a loan, okay, when you get a loan, you give others the loan, but when you get the loan, okay, at the end, Islamically, it's going to be basically what you would have to pay back. Okay, so the loan, the money that you get, okay, and therefore that becomes a debt on you. Okay. If someone might question, well, how is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet sallam, not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the Prophet sallam was making the dua, أمتعني بسمعي وبصري, let me enjoy my hearing and my sight, and then certainly وَجْعَلْهُ الْوَارِثَ مِنِّي, and make this something be what would last forever. Here's a question. Scholars actually questioned this one, and they said, well, how is it that we're basically saying وَجْعَلْهُ الْوَارِثَ مِنِّي? What does الْوَارِثَ مِنِّي actually mean? Okay, الوارث basically means that that's what remains from me. Well, wait a minute. Well, that's what remains. Well, but anyways, the body is going to die. How is it that that's what's going to remain? Is it possible to make that remain? Other scholars, they said, well, what that means is that you don't want it to end before your life. That is your health, your sight, your hearing. In other words, the different vital things that you need in your body. You want it to always be lasting, basically throughout your life. Other scholars, they said, well, no, this is metaphorical. Metaphorical? What does that even mean? They said, well, Isama basically resembles Abu Bakr, and al-Basar resembles Umar ibn al-Khattab. How is that? They said, well, because the Prophet ﷺ in a hadith, he said, Huma sam'u wal-basar. They are sam'u wal-basar, so therefore I'm basically making a dua for them. Al-Qurtubi said, هذا تأويل بعيد. He said, that's a very far away. It's a very far interpretation. And that is not what is intended in this hadith. Here's one thing. When I look at this, when you say, وَجَعَلْهُ الْوَارِثَ مِنِّي, and let my health be الْوَارِث, there's one thing that in modern science we know that your health depends also on your family's health. So they'll tell you, what is your family history? Oh, we had diabetes, cancer, blood issues, or whatever it is, or probably sight problems. That's basically your genetics. So when you yourself contribute a healthy lifestyle in your body, you're not just making this for yourself, but that's also producing a healthy lifestyle, or perhaps even contributing something that not only during your lifetime, but it also would surpass even your children's time, it would include that, and that's الوارث. So we know in modern science that health is also part of the wealth. Just like you would have wealth and that becomes the inheritance that you would pass on to your children. Even health is passed on to your children as well. You live a healthy lifestyle, that is passed on to your children as well. And certainly it can also alter some genetic components in you, and later on it becomes passed on to your children, right? And that's why if a certain family has obesity, you're going to find their children basically suffering from the same type of obesity that they're probably their father or mother or whatever their family was suffering from. And the list goes on and on. So we basically make the dua, Ya Allah, the healthy things about me, let that also be the wealth and the value and the good things that my children and the generations later to come would inherit from me. So it's quite interesting how وَجْعَلْهُ الْوَارِثَ مِنِّي, but they didn't know that piece. I think I didn't really give the detailed answer to the difference between the debt and loan. So I'm just going to make it really quick. Loan is the actual act or contract of borrowing a sum of money. Okay. The debt is the obligation or amount owned. So maybe that explains it in a different way. Okay. Let's see right there. خاصة is basically putting the dua for us. ومن طاعتك ما تبلغنا به جنتك ومن اليقين ما تهون علينا به مصائب الدنيا. Exactly. So that's basically the dua that you would always find actually at the end of those Qur'ans. Just that one came to mind. Absolutely. That's the dua that we would make. Okay, let's continue. والشمس والقمر حسبانا. You know what the word والشمس والقمر بحسبان or الشمس والقمر حسبانا or all of that. That actually comes frequently in the Quran. Now, I wonder if I could just really quick and actually go to my Quran app and ask it to give me the number of times that we had the word husban in the Quran. I don't really know. So what did it say? It said 3 times. Why did I feel that it was more than that? So the word husban, we got Surah Al'an'am, this one, and we got Surah Al-Kahf. ويرسل عليها حسبانا من السماء. And in Surah Al-Rahman, الشمس والقمر بحسبان. Okay, let's see right there. Okay, but the word hasiba, just the root, hasibitum, hasabtum, hasbuna, hasabu, etc., and all those roots, they came in 24 times. Okay, let's get into at least the shams and al-qamar. Husbana. What does that mean? So number one is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that this calculation, this intricate orbit or the intricate function of how the sun, the moon, and how they orbit, that all of that is basically for the interest and for the benefit of human beings. In other words, nothing's going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's basically for you. In other words, recognize the bounty, recognize the blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed you with, even if you're looking at the light, even if you're looking at those things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created right there. So in other words, husbana, the first interpretation said that means بحساب يتعلق به مصالح العباد, that it was done in an intricate and in a certain structure just to benefit the people. That's the first interpretation of husbana. So shamsu wal qamar husbana, meaning to bring in benefit and interest for people. The second interpretation, they said no, husbana actually is focusing and emphasizing a very specific thing and telling us that it is precise, that everything basically was put in a structure in a precise manner. Let's see. And that's basically Al-Akhfar saying, well, husbana is basically speaking about precision right there, and exactly like you would say that there is precision in numbers, etc. But here's one thing. For the Arab, they didn't understand much about numbers. the ones during the time of the Prophet. Okay, let's go back in history. The ones to excel in math historically. Okay. Before even the Arab, the Indians. India was actually the place that was known to being in arithmetics, math. When we say India, we're not talking about, the India, that India. Yeah, I should have called it Little India because it's not little at all. Okay. But that was including all those areas that we would call today Bangladesh, Pakistan, parts of Afghanistan. That was all called Bilad al-Hind, and including Sindh, basically those islands also in the south as well. All of that was considered Bilad al-Hind. Okay. They were the ones that were known to excel in math. Later, the Greeks. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Nahnu ummatun ummiyya." We are an illiterate nation. That is speaking about the Arab, that they were illiterate. They were not excelling in math, but they were excelling in literature, at least in poetry and in expression and poetry and all of that. That's what they were excelling in. Okay, it's quite interesting. And you look at the Greek at that time; they were excelling in philosophy. What was happening with the Greek today? They're really big. I don't know, whatever. But they were excelling in philosophy. They were excelling in thinking about those areas. Every single society makes it. And then later on, the Muslims, they started in specifically during the time of al-Abbasiyin. So we're talking about 880. Okay. We're talking about the time, in terms of Hijrah, we're talking about from 132-year Hijrah until 656 Hijriyah. That was the time when the Abbasid, okay, so my son is telling me the Gregorian calendar, what year is that? 800 and what? 800, okay. Till 1258. So that was the Abbasid time. I know the Hijri, he knows the Gregorian calendar. Okay, 1258, the ending, that was 656 Hijri. Really? 656 is equivalent to that? Okay, all right. I'm learning. But wait a minute. I think you're including. Okay. All right. I think I have no option but to submit to that. That's what my son is telling me. All right. Let's go back right there. So when you look at later, during the Abbasid time, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur gave the order to get the education and basically the knowledge that other countries had basically mastered. So he got the scholars from India, the scholars from China, the scholars from in their books, basically from the Greek and from different countries, and basically decided to make a university, and that was called Baytul Hikmah. It was called Baytul Hikmah in Baghdad. It was a whole city, but that city was actually a university, translating over 150 languages and basically translating those books. And that's why Baytul Hikmah basically became not only this university, but it became the birth of uniting the different knowledge and making the Arabic language as the standard language that combines all those resources to make it accessible for humanity. And that was the golden era for the Muslims. And that's when they basically started learning and, let's say, developing different types of different kinds of math. And when we say Arab, it is probably not fair to just make it as Arab, because you had the Persians also contribute and contribute massively. And we're speaking about Kazakhstan, we're talking about Uzbekistan, we're talking about Kyrgyzstan, we're talking about Afghanistan. All of that was considered as part of the Muslim empire at the time. Okay, so and those were Persians, those were considered Tatar. At the time, they used to consider them Tatar, but the Tatar didn't come in until later. And the Tatar, unfortunately, they came in and basically had invaded the Muslim world at the time, which is Baghdad, and simply threw all those books inside the Euphrates and the Euphrates River, and that river became black for a couple days because of the amount of ink. And those were the Mongols. They were also called the Tatar at the time. They were the ones to invade. They were not Muslim, but later when they had become Muslim, that basically had brought in a new contribution later on, and they were al-Mamalik later on. They started basically being the ones to control the Muslims. They were al-Mamalik and certainly continued within this. Why am I speaking about all this hisab? Because when we speak about Khawarizm, we're speaking about Khawarizm, we're speaking about logarithms, we're speaking about algebra, we're speaking about all that. You might say, well, wait a minute, I thought the Prophet ﷺ said, Nahnu ummatun ummiyya. That was during that time the Prophet ﷺ was, the Prophet ﷺ and the Arab were resembling basically an illiterate society, but later on, the Muslim contribution in mathematics, in science, in different fields was something that it would be important to go back to a book. It is called The House of Wisdom by Jonathan Lyons. Jonathan Lyons, he did a great job, except in one of his chapters. In one of his chapters, he did a horrible job when he talked about Islam. But when he talked about the Muslim contribution in that House of Wisdom and the contribution that the Muslims had on the West, and he also explains, Jonathan Lyons explains in a number of different lectures and even other books, how the modern West wanted to deliberately disregard and erase the Muslim contribution and make as if modern West traces back to the Greek, and deliberately basically erasing the Muslim contribution because they basically wanted to erase that as if it did not even exist, in the same white supremacy that they would basically engage in eliminating any Muslim contribution or any contribution for basically the brown man. Of course, when we're talking about brown man, we're speaking about whether African, we're speaking about Arab, we're speaking about basically Persian as well. All of that they would consider brown man. Okay, Usbana, that it basically is relating to numbering and all of that. Okay, the other thing is that, let's say, others, they basically said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically made the moon and the sun to orbit in a certain precise orbit in a way that it does not increase and does not decrease, and therefore that is to reflect Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's might, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's precision, and therefore relating to understanding wahdaniyat Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does wahdaniyya actually mean? Wahdaniyya meaning that he is one. That he is one and the only one, and no other Lord is beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's no God but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, let's see. Husbana, another interpretation, they said it means diya'a, meaning light. So you're saying Shams and al-Qamar are actually in light? Well, yeah. What's the evidence? They said, well, Husbana actually means fire in Lugha Arabiya. Where did you get that from? They said, well, it said وَيُرْسِلَ عَلَيْهَا حُسْبَانًا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ. وَيُرْسِلَ عَلَيْهَا حُسْبَانًا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ. They said, well, that actually means fire. When this ayah in Surah Al-Kahf, when, remember those two guys? The first guy was basically not kafir, and he had the Jannah and basically that garden, and then this Muslim guy comes to him and tells him to be thankful, and he was like, yeah, I'm actually down on a better situation that you are, then therefore you can educate me about God and about what it means to be privileged, because I'm already privileged more than you, then therefore I knew how to handle everything better than you. And that's when ويرسل عليها حسبانا من السماء فتصبح صعيدا زلقا أو يصبح ماؤها غورا. And of course, the ayah continues. But then يرسل عليها حسبانا من السماء basically means, aren't you afraid that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might send حسبانا من السماء, like a fire to basically burn everything, like a tornado to burn everything down, and then it becomes basically history. وَالْحُسْبَانَ, that's what this one's quite interesting. I never knew that, to be honest. Al-Husbana, Husbana, with a tap marbuta right there, actually means a pillow. Or in some countries, they call it a cushion. That was quite interesting. You're like, how is it that it's a cushion? You know, how did you get there? And then he said, well, there's actually in Tafseer al-Qurtubi and Mujmal al-Lugha, and that it's basically called a pillow. You never would think of a moon and a sun being something similar like a pillow. What is a pillow? Is it usually circle? I mean, let's say, well, how did they get there? But, you know, at least we would, it's quite interesting how al-wisad al-saghira, a small pillow, or a small something like a comforter type of thing. Well, at least that's what it means also in Lugha Arabiya, at least al-husbana with the ta' marbuta. But okay, so what is the most accurate interpretation then? Al-husbana can actually mean all, really, number one, because the sun really does have the fire. But well, the moon doesn't have the fire. Well, in other ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically called الشمس سراج and القمر منير. What's the difference? Siraj makes fire. Al-Munir is something that reflects light, kind of like a mirror. Okay, that's Al-Munir. It reflects light. Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that Shams produces light, but Al-Qamar reflects light. But at the same time, Shams wal Qamar husbana, does that mean that this is talking about them being something that is illuminated? Yes, that can be a meaning. And can it also mean that it's in a precise orbit? Yes, that's another meaning. And then when you look at ذَلِكَ تَقَدِيرُ الْعَزِيزِ الْعَلِيمِ, when you look at the word taqadir, that would get us closer to telling us about precision, that it was relating to precision. Because if you want to consider a certain meaning, you're going to also look at the words there and also the past in order to help you basically get to a precise identification, or at least a precise definition for that word. So when it says taqadir, this is actually taking us further closer to the word hisab and speaking about it as in precision. Okay, ذَلِكَ تَقَدِيرُ الْعَزِيزِ الْعَلِيمِ. That's basically based on the precision that the Lord Almighty, Al-Aziz, the one that is not in need of anyone basically to obey him or worship him, and he is Al-Alim. With this precise basically creation, he is Al-Alim. He is the all-knowing. Okay, it is right now 12:06. So we will end right here. I know we didn't do a lot of tafsir because we were pretty much, engaging in a different topic, but that's all right. It's a Saturday, so yeah, it's okay. Inshallah. So subhanak Allahumma bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. If there are any questions, Inshallah, we will answer, or if you would like to actually say anything that you probably would like to add, that's okay too. All right, let's say right there. You, oh, Habibat Albi Khasatullah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Rabbi preserve you. I am so proud of you and all of that, mashallah, the great discipline.